Yeast breads are wonderful, and with just a little extra knowledge about nurturing the yeast culture, your breads will become the household favorite and your neighbor's envy. Today, we will discuss the basics of making quality yeast breads. They are not as complicated as you may think. Yes, they do take some time, that's how yeast works, but the wait is so worth the final product. In quick review, we will be using the principles you learned about the structural components of flour. Because there is both starch and protein in flour, we use these to build the type of bread you want. For example, French and Italian breads have little or no oil, so they are hard-crusted and delicious. Dinner rolls and dessert breads have lots of oil, so are tender, soft, and delicious. Sourdough ferments the starch and is delicious. You see, there is a lot of deliciousness happening when you understand just a few principles about flour. And in the kitchen today, we will learn the basics of making white bread using commercial dry yeast. It is faster than sourdough and using a poolish, but both of which will be covered in a separate lesson. Also, I will demonstrate the sponge technique, which can reduce your production time by at least 1 hour. The traditional white bread takes about 3 hours before it even goes into the oven. So let's go into the kitchen and get started. I'd like to demonstrate how to rehydrate and build a yeast culture for bread making. This is the most critical aspect of making bread. Without a good culture grown, you're not going to get good effective bread. Now obviously there are different kinds of breads, ones that are heavier and ones that are lighter, and those depend on other factors, but I'm not going to worry about those factors right now. What I want to do is show you how to develop a viable culture. The first thing I'm going to do is explain the requirements for a good culture. The 4 requirements for a viable culture is moisture, nutrition, time, and temperature. With those 4 elements, we can make a viable culture. Now, there is one other ingredient, one more element that plays a huge factor in the development of a yeast culture, and that is oxygen. Without oxygen, yeast makes alcohol, and that's how we end up with beer and wine, is because they are developed in an anaerobic situation. For us in bread, we're talking about aerobic, and we want lots of oxygen actually to help the yeast grow and develop quickly. Moisture is the first item. I'm going to be using water, 2 cups of warm water. Now, any liquid that's over 115 degrees actually can kill the yeast. So a good warm water, anything less than 115 degrees is acceptable. I just used 105 degree water. Now, the liquid could be milk, it could be grape juice for all that matter to grow yeast. But just moisture of some sort. Now, the next thing is that we need nutrition. In that nutrition, I'm going to use sugar. Now, yeast loves sugar. I'm not actually measuring it because lots of different breads have lots of different variations. However, it does need a nourishment. The yeast culture needs lots of nourishment. Now, in some breads, you'll find that there is no sugar, and that's because yeast can convert starch into sugar. And those are for things like French breads, Italian breads, ones that are not very sweet and a little bit more tough and characteristic. Now, I'm going to add yeast at this point. A little note. You'll find that there's instant yeast and there's dry activated yeast. There's some other ones that are sold commercially to bakeries. But for home use, you're going to find the dry, active, or instant yeast. There's a lot of discussion on the internet about the differences between the two. Primarily, instant yeast needs to be used for bread machines where things are timed rather than processed visually with a human context. As far as the King Bakery School is concerned, because the processes that they use to make dry yeast anymore is so similar that for the most part they can be used interchangeably with little difference. Now I'm going to sprinkle some in. Now again, I don't have to measure because my water is not over 115 degrees. The more yeast I use, the faster the culture is going to grow and lighten my bread. But enough is enough, and I'm going to sprinkle it on top of the warm liquid, and now I'm going to allow it to do what's called blooming, or allow it to bloom. Some people call it rehydrate. That's technically true, but the more romantic word is bloom, because it really is a viable live organism, and as it flowers, that's where it came from, the word bloom. You'll notice here perhaps where it's rehydrating already and making these little lines. This is where the carbon dioxide is already starting to be produced. In an oxygen environment, this is what's made is carbon dioxide, but there's also heat. Now, while I'm waiting for this to bloom, I want to explain that the temperature of the water is significant, especially because it needs to be less than 115 degrees. But if it's a little cooler than that, not to worry, it just takes a little more time, because one of the byproducts of the growth of the culture is heat. Not only does it give off carbon dioxide for leavening, but it also creates heat. Because the culture, as it grows, produces heat as a byproduct, many commercial bakeries will make their first batch like at 60-degree temperature water, and the next one at 68, and the next one at 76, etc., so that they don't all come up at the same time, so that they have time to mock it up, proof it, bake it off, and have the next batch come in. So I think that's an interesting concept and good practice in many commercial bakeries. Let's give this about 5 or 6 more minutes. It takes about 10 minutes altogether to bloom, and then I'll be right back. You may not be able to see it from there. However, you can see here how this is rehydrated and is actually starting to grow up just a little bit. It's not a lot at this point because there's nothing to hold the carbon dioxide. It's just being off-gassed into the atmosphere. For us to make actual bread, we need some flour, and for it to taste good, we need some salt. And basically, those are the only 2 more things that we have to have. Now, I'm going to stir the yeast culture in and make sure that this is nice and blended. And I'm going to add some flour. There are many methods of mocking up, blending, and proofing breads. The technique I'm going to use now is called a sponge technique. Now, before I forget, I'm going to go ahead and put some salt in, because bread without salt is just flat tasting. That's all there is to it. A sponge technique allows us to put only part of the flour in and make basically a batter, and let that be the first proof rather than making the full developed dough ball. I'm going to add a little bit more. And the reason we do this is because it takes about an hour off of the total build time, the total make time on the bread. The reason that is because you'll find that, remember we talked about how oxygen is critical for the development of the yeast. The more oxygen that's available, the faster the yeast culture grows. And so by making a sponge technique, there's less flour to encapsulate the yeast and more oxygen available, which makes it grow faster. This sponge has grown double in 30 minutes. If you'll notice, most recipes for white bread anyway, it says to make a dough ball, and the first rise takes between an hour and 15 minutes, an hour and 40 minutes, sometimes an hour and a half on average. So we basically got the first rise in about 30% of the time. Now, with bread, I could knead this with some more flour and finish it, and it would be perfectly good bread. To make the bread softer, I'm going to be adding some oil, which shortens the protein chains, and that's another lesson. And I'm going to stir this in. You can see how light that's become. And I'll turn this out on the board and knead this together. and I will continue to knead until this is soft and elastic. And finishing up bread is a different class. Thank you for joining us. Good day.